Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the psychology of reasoning. This will be divided into 4 parts. The first part will provide an introduction to the topic. Then we'll talk about some of the elements of reasoning, concepts, and deductive reasoning, and then finally inductive reasoning and analogy. So let's plunge into the topic. So far, we've been talking about the topic of cognitive psychology, or how people think. And we've covered sensation and perception, which provides the material for our thinking. And we've covered learning and memory. If all of our senses, they only last about a second or two. If we don't retain them, then it doesn't become fodder for thought. And we've seen that sensation and perception, learning and memory are present in basically all vertebrates. But we've also talked about some things that look to be unique to humans. All humans have the capacity for language. And other animals have maybe a little tiny toehold in language by means of engaging in symbolic reference if they're really taught. But it doesn't come spontaneously to them. And many people also think that rationality or reasoning is unique to humans. Famously, man is the rational animal, according to Aristotle. But this deserves some attention. So first off, what is reasoning? What is involved in reasoning? What are its elements? Well, let's start with a very simple kind of reasoning. This is a famous syllogism made famous by John Stuart Mill. It goes like this. All men are mortal. So that's the first statement. All men are mortal. Then you come across this word, Socrates. You have no idea who Socrates is, or even if it's a who. Socrates, maybe it's a website, maybe it's a city, maybe it's a mythological figure. But then you learn to identify Socrates, and you discover that Socrates is a man. Well, if all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then you can conclude with certainty that Socrates is mortal. Well, we see here some important elements. First, we see that reasoning is a process of integrating information to acquire knowledge or certainty. Maybe before you weren't certain that Socrates is mortal, but now you've proven that Socrates is mortal. Or maybe you didn't know who Socrates was in the first place. As soon as you know who he is, and you combine it with your knowledge that all men are mortal, you discover something new about Socrates, that Socrates, not being a website, is mortal. Now, we can break this up a little bit further. When we say that we're integrating information, what exactly is it that we're integrating? Well, let's look at the elements. In a syllogistic argument, like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal, one thing that you're integrating are propositions, like sentences. All men are mortal is a sentence or a proposition. And in an argument, all men are mortal is what's known as the major premise of the argument. Then you have another proposition, like Socrates is a man. That's the minor premise. And then the conclusion is Socrates is mortal. So when we say that reason is a process of integrating information, we mean in part that it's a process of integrating propositions. We're integrating propositions into a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. That's something that's worth noticing, by the way. Sometimes people make arguments, and all they'll state is a minor premise. So they might say, oh, you don't think that Socrates can die? But Socrates is a man. Well, but that doesn't really serve as much of an argument unless you assume first that all men are mortal. So reasoning is a process of integrating propositions. But those propositions, like all men are mortal are composed of parts too, their own elements. So proposition like all men are mortal has certain concepts like men and mortal. Concepts are equivalence classes. There are also relations like is-a or not or. If all men are not mortal, that is a very different implication. If all men or websites are mortal, that is a different implication too. And then there are quantifiers: all, some, none. Again, if no men are mortal or some men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, we don't know if Socrates is really mortal. So the quantifiers are playing an important role too. So to put it another way, we can say that reasoning is a process of integrating information. And the information here are concepts, relations, and quantifiers into propositions, and propositions into arguments. Now, there's another important element of reasoning too. So let's take all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. We call that a valid syllogism. All right. Let's take a different kind of argument that you might hear. It goes something like this. All men are mortal, Socrates is immortal, therefore Socrates is a man. All men are mortal, Socrates is immortal, therefore Socrates is a man. Now you'll notice that something different has happened here. Instead of Socrates is a man, we have Socrates is immortal. In the first sentence, we could simply substitute, since we know that Socrates is a man, we can simply substitute Socrates for where man goes. And that's what we do in the conclusion. Socrates is mortal. It's just substituting. We can't do that substitution in the second argument, right? So all men are mortal. If we just substitute Socrates for mortal, we end up with all men are Socrates. That's really weird, all right? Also, even though the conclusion seems right, and this argument seems intuitively reasonish, we can see what's wrong with it by changing it just so slightly. So all men are mortal, Socrates is immortal, therefore Socrates is a man. Let's change it to this way. All dogs are mortal, Socrates is immortal. If we follow the same reasoning in the second argument, we end up with Socrates as a dog. That's not right. So an important element of reasoning is that it follows certain logical rules. The logical rule in the first is what's known as affirming the antecedent, and in the second, we violate a logical rule. This is the fallacy of affirming the consequent. So when we say that reasoning is a process of integrating information, we should be a little bit more exact. We can say that reasoning is a process of using logic to integrate information, concepts, relations, and quantifiers into propositions, and propositions into conclusions. So all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. Follows certain rules of logic, it uses certain concepts, relations, and quantifiers, and that's what makes this form of thinking so powerful. But where does reason come from? There's a kind of mechanical element to reasoning, these little parts and rules that govern how they're put together. And you might be tempted to think then that since this is a kind of mental calculation, maybe reasoning is done the way that, say, a calculator performs its calculations, and everything is sort of just built in. That certainly has been an idea that's tempted a lot of thinkers over the years. But it's not one that tempted a Swiss psychologist by the name of Jean Piaget. Piaget thought that reason is actually something that develops slowly over time. Piaget was a Swiss psychologist, And in about 1920, he developed the very first cognitive theory. Before Piaget, there wasn't much of anything to cognitive psychology beyond perception, learning, and memory. At that point wasn't a psychological study of infants or language development. He was the first to examine conceptual development, the first one to look at the psychology of mathematical and scientific reasoning, and the first to look at moral development as well. So he really is one of the, I would say, greatest psychologists of the 20th century. I should also just say, on a kind of personal note, that Piaget is the reason that I became a psychologist. I thought, maybe a little naively, that if only we knew how to develop rationality, a lot of the world's problems would go away. But I should say that Piaget's theory hasn't always fared very well. But there was one insight that worked out really well. Let's take this Piagetian interview with a 6-year-old and test that theory that reasoning is just part of the hardware of the brain. So he asks the child, give me the name. Tell me something that is alive. And the kid says, animals. Okay, that's right. So he says, a cat? And the kid says, yes, we often see some cats. An automobile? No, it runs. The wind? No, because it does not run. A bird? Yes, because it flies in the air. An airplane? No, because it flies in the air, like birds. A fly? Yes, because it flies in the air. Now, this is an incredible interview, if you think about it. Two things are worth noticing. The first thing is, if you look at the child's answers are 100% correct. Animals are alive, cats are alive, automobiles are not alive, the wind isn't alive, a bird is alive, an airplane is not alive, a fly is alive. So that part the child gets right. But look at the child's reasoning. The child's reasoning is chock full of contradictions and weird claims. So, is the wind not alive because it does not run? That doesn't seem right. What about a bird? He says that a bird is alive because it flies in the air. But an airplane also flies in the air like birds, but is not alive. That is a contradiction. What about a fly? Yes, because it flies in the air. So he just reaffirms the thing that made the airplane, would imply that the airplane is alive. Not good reasoning. So Piaget thought that in these cases, what we're seeing is the development of rationality, a point in the development of rationality, that to engage in reasoning, that takes a child's thinking being in what Piaget called the formal operational stage, the ability to reason abstractly and hypothetically, meaning about things that the kid can't see or are maybe even contrary to fact. But to do that, you first have to be able to reason logically about concrete objects and events. And that only happens, according to Piaget, in the concrete operational stage. But that has a prerequisite too, according to Piaget. In order to reason logically about concrete objects and events, you first have to be able to represent objects and events by mental symbols. Mental symbols that would sort of stand in for the terms in, say, the syllogistic reasoning. But in the pre-operational stage, although they can do that, they don't yet reason logically, and so they fail tests of conservation, which we'll get to in a minute. And to reason about objects and events by means of mental symbols, you first have to be able to see and act on the world. That being able to see and act on the world is what gives rise to the ability to represent objects and events by mental symbols. And so this is a developmental theory. To get to reasoning, you first have to go through these previous 3 stages. Now, Piaget's theory, I should say, even though I was enormously fond of it for many years, many details of Piaget's theories have not fared well at all. Just as an example, his theory grossly underestimates the capacities of infants and young children. His theory overestimates the capacities of adults. Cognitive development isn't really as stage-like and tidy as he makes it out to be, and there are many other problems with his theory. But he had one insight that I think lasts and is really his legacy, and that is that the development of concepts is crucial for rationality. That idea is a lasting scientific legacy of Piaget's. That the reason that we misreason is often because our concepts are wrong. That maybe when we think that all men are mortal, we're not including in men maybe women. All right. Or when we're thinking about mortality, we think that mortality maybe is just dying in hospitals and not a more general feature of the animal world. Now, these conceptual mistakes might happen to you, but they're pretty common among young children. And so a lot of the work of rationality is going to be going on very subtly behind the scenes in children's mind without anybody noticing. And that's what we're going to pick up on in the next lecture, which is the development of concepts.